You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Welcome to TFM's local books and comic show, and I'm just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and here with me, at least for the news, is the one, the only, Bruce Gibson.
You know what? I don't know if I'm the one and only, because if you Google my name, I think there's other Bruce Gibsons out there. But...
Oh, there could be. There could be.
I think I'm
they
the only one who's a Star Trek fan.
Maybe. Well, yeah. But hey, and we're glad to have you. So I'm so glad you're here. We've got so much fun stuff to talk about today, and yeah, really excited. We want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's joining us, and make sure, of course, you're doing all the things like following us on social media, like at Trek.fm. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We got the listeners only discussion group. You can join as listeners from all over the world discuss what we talk about here on the network. Of course, you can also find us with the website at Trek.fm, where you can see all the stuff we're doing there podcast-wise, as well as go to the contact section. You can send us an email. So go to trek.fm/contact, choose a show, and you can talk to Bruce and I, and which would be really fun. We'd love to catch up with you there. Yeah. So, the other thing you could do, support us through Patreon. Patreon is the place where we help make sure that all of the shows here keep coming to you each and every week. It does cost quite a bit to do all this, so we would love your help. And we've got some great associate producers here through Patreon. Casey Petit and Greg Rosier, we really appreciate their support. They make sure that each and every show here on the network, as well as Literary Treks, comes to you. And so, again, if you like what we do here, go to patreon.com/TrekFM and become part of our team and make sure that we can keep doing this. So, Bruce, we have a couple of comics that we're going to be talking about because Year 5 is coming to a close. And I have to say, one of the things that we've talked about with the Year 5 is the fact that, well, there's been a lot going on, and I feel like this is really all bringing it together. We're going to talk about issues 22 and 23, and so I would say that issue 22, we really start to bring some stuff together with the revelations that we get about Gary 7, which I thought was fantastic. We're finally getting that now.
Yeah, I was expecting at this point, and I was certainly hoping, yes, that we would get to this point by the times we got to the last few issues. And I'm not disappointed. I'm very pleased that we're finally getting the answers that we deserve.
Yeah. No, I agree with you 100% in that. I thought the idea that we learn in this issue that Gary 7 had been the one that had helped the Tholians with this weapon test where we ended up, getting Bright Eyes saving him, I thought was really fascinating. And, it's interesting too, because, Spock makes this pronunciation because they're in front of the Federation Council. And he's like, but we know Gary 7 to be, somebody who is on the side of galactic stability. So that was really interesting because this whole thing, it really leaves you wondering as to still, what the whole process is here for Gary 7. You're still pretty worried, I think, about, why would he, what would be his whole thought process of helping the Tholians do something so terrible?
Right. And then you've got Spock, of course, like you're saying, hey, Gary's a good guy. And, but we know that he's been not so good, that he's been trying to destroy them and get in their way and kill them. And so it's interesting that Spock is actually saying, he's someone that is out there doing good, when he also doesn't understand why Gary's doing what he's doing, because it isn't.
Yeah, I think that's the really interesting thing here, is that we still don't quite we don't have a behind the scenes as to what it is that Gary's up to, and it was, like you said, it was kind of strange because Spock seems to be on his side, which is a little bit weird because, hasn't he been responsible for, like you said, almost hunting down these characters?
Yeah.
And trying to kill them multiple times. So yeah, that part threw me a little bit. And thankfully, I mean, we're going to get some serious revelations as to exactly what's going on here in the end, which I love. The next issue is kind of going to blow open this entire thing and give us exactly what it is that's going on.
I know. I mean, that's what's making it hard for me to talk about it, because really the next issue, we really get into the meat of this. I mean, this issue 22 is setting up, I'm guessing, a trilogy of issues to come up with the conclusion to this year 5 series. So this is 22. We have 23. I guess more than a trilogy, because we at least get up to we at least get up to issue number 5. I mean 25. Boy, I don't know what I'm doing today. But I just think that Spock is probably looking at this in his logical sense of, he knows what Gary's mission is. It may not make sense to them, but he's probably thinking there's a logical reason why he's doing what he's doing. We just don't know the answers, which is, as the readers, we feel the same way.
Right. Yeah. I think the other really, fascinating thing here is, and there are a couple of things that I want to kind of mention. One is that we get the Andorian, and I think you would say her name, Renee, who is running for Federation president here, really questioning Spock and the crew of the Enterprise, and how, she is somebody who is much more on the side of protectionism, and, really, Spock even calls out, the idea that the bias of opinion that challenge her own. And I thought that was really interesting, kind of playing with that. But in some ways, she's not all wrong. And I think that was also interesting as well. In the end, and yeah, we'll talk about it in a second, but the Tholians are trying to take over the Federation. And that's what I thought was really interesting, is she's not all wrong. She just doesn't have all the facts, right? Nobody does on the ground here. And so what was really interesting is kind of watching this come together to make some sense here. And this, like you said, it does a great job, I think, of kind of bringing a lot of stuff that's happened in year 5 together to kind of set us up for the end.
Well, yeah, because if the Tholians are coming to attack the Federation, why isn't everybody else really freaking out, especially from this Enterprise crew? But I think it's because of Bright Eyes. They have this trust in Bright Eyes, who's telling them that this isn't what, the Tholians aren't going to do this unless they have some kind of reason. And and even Kirk resigns himself from dealing with this, because he's the one who's supposed to meet with the president, yet he sends Spock, Uhura, and Chekhov down in his place while he goes elsewhere to go do something personal. And it seems to me as if Kirk has resigned himself from the Enterprise, because this is the end of the 5-year mission, and he mentally has is in his head saying, I've stepped down. I'm taking a back role to all of this. And he doesn't see the Tholian situation as being much of a threat because of Bright Eyes.
Right. Well, and I think that's the one of the things that I wanted to mention I thought was so interesting was Kirk. The thing that he does is he goes to where Carol Marcus is stationed, which it looks like she's stationed on a scientific research area in Monument Valley, which is kind of strange. Why you would deface one of Monument Valley's massive pillars of stone, put a base of scientific exploration on there. It seems very against science in the first place to destroy a natural phenomenon like that. But anyway, he leaves flowers and he leaves a book for David close to where that is, and then walks away because, of course, we all know that he's been asked to have no part in David's life, and there's this whole thing in which Kirk is losing the family and the Enterprise. It's about to be taken away from him. He's about to be made an admiral. He doesn't have this family that he could have had. This opportunity to have a family with Carol and David. And he also is feeling the sting of Spock telling him no of being the next captain of the Enterprise. And so he kind of, I think, feels betrayed by Spock in some ways. And I think what was really interesting is kind of seeing how much this all is affecting the character and the person of Kirk. And that is not something I think that we're necessarily used to. Just this very deep, personal, soulful pain that we see Kirk in.
Yeah, because we see him on the bridge and he just seems devastated that Spock isn't going to take the Enterprise.
Yep.
And he's alone there on the bridge, which is some beautiful artwork of the bridge and him standing on it. But I also kept thinking back to the Lost Years novel, because we recently discussed that, which takes place in this same time frame, and it approaches it a little differently, but still it's Spock rejecting the Enterprise. In that book, he was going to take a science vessel, you know, and it's Kirk leaving his baby behind, but nobody he can trust is going to take care of it for him, in both of those situations. And so he does have a real life baby, a son that he can't even see. And now he's losing this baby, to your point. It's like everything he gets that he loves is taken away from him, yet he keeps going on.
100%. I mean, I think, honestly, you're really just kind of nailing exactly what Kirk is feeling, and I think it makes for just such a fascinating thing. Like, I think this is what makes this issue really interesting. And so I think it's really well done. I love that we have such a. I really kind of love that we have such a pain, for Kirk in this. And I think what it does is it reads really interestingly into issue 23 as we look at that. And, here we find and we get the massive revelations about what Gary 7 has been behind, what Aegis has been behind, and what they're actually trying to do. And I mean, it is at the same level as every Bond villain out there. Like, that's basically their goal, and which I thought was kind of hysterical.
Well, yeah, because, it does remind me, Gary 7 kind of reminds me of a Bond character, even from the original series. Some of this I wasn't that surprised about, though. I mean, it's like Aegis is behind this, but I mean, we've always kind of known that there's some reason, but it really is about correcting history. But it's not that history is off course. It's just they don't like how the future ends up playing out. And they go through this whole explanation of what happens with, the Klingons and Praxis blowing up to what's happened with the Cardassians, like, for example, taking over Bajor and the Borg, and all these things are coming in the future. And they're reacting to this as if this is a slow death to the galaxy, that this is the thing that's tearing it apart. So we got to start this over And so we're going to start this over with the Tholians because they have they've got nothing in this game. They're going to help just like lock everything down with their webs, and then Aegis is going to control everything.
Yeah, I mean, and they talk about the idea that the Tholians are unified. And in that unity, they're going to be able to create a universe that doesn't have these issues. And I think, in some ways that's really interesting, this idea of, trying to unite behind an alien species to which is more of like kind of a hive mentality and everything. But I think obviously, we know that the danger of that is that these aliens are that what they're trying to do is wrong still. Like you can't, because what I thought was really interesting is Aegis is really coming off as this godlike group. They're making the decisions, right? And I get why you'd want to make those decisions, but they don't have the right to make these decisions. That's not, again, it's not their right to do this. And so I think that is super fascinating to me.
And it makes me think of a lot of things like, is Aegis involved in what's going on throughout the whole universe? I think so. I mean, I don't think it's just this sector of the universe, but it seems like this is the sector where all these bad things can happen.
Yep.
Because he's never mentioned anything that happens in the Delta Quadrant or the Gamma Quadrant. Didn't even mention the Dominion in this.
Yep.
But, if they can see that far into the future that they want to change it, it makes me wonder what haven't we seen past the 24th century that's so devastating? Because even though these things have happened, bad things always happen, but the galaxy moves on, and the galaxy has moved on from our standpoint of what we know what happens in the future. But this tells me, something like really bad comes after this, and to the point that they're going to rewrite history.
Well, and I mean, the thing that they kind of show us, in these panels, is we see all of the things that happen, from, like you said, Praxis blowing up. I mean, we see all the way even to Picard, and, what happens at the shipping yards there and on Mars, right? I mean, so we're throwing all this together is that they're seeing that the galaxy is in a state that to which it's never going to get beyond these kind of issues. And yet at the same time, I think what is kind of important for, and Kirk is kind of arguing is like, it's not your right, it's not your right to make this choice. Like, and I think it's interesting here because, we have Kirk being the one that goes to confront Gary 7, and he leaves Spock in charge of being the one who's going to try and, get everything taken care of, in the sense of like, he put Spock in charge of the Enterprise. And I thought that was really fascinating. And one of the kind of what we were talking about last issue, we end up with, I think he's also trying to show Spock that, Spock thinks his emotionalism is not something that's good for command, and that he can't work with his logical side and his emotional side at the same time and it be good for command. And I think one of the reasons I think he chooses Spock for this mission is I think he's actually trying to teach Spock that, no, your emotional side and your logical side can work together to make command work.
And you'd think Spock would have learned that, because when he confronted Gary 7, Gary's trying to persuade Spock onto his side of things because it's very logical. And Spock says, well, unfortunately for you, I'm not yet a being of pure logic. So it works to his favor. That balance is his strength. And he's going to abandon that. I would think after this that he would learn that there's an advantage to having both.
No, I 100% agree with you. And it makes it... this is one of the things where I do feel like we kind of... it It creates a little bit of an issue for me because of I know that they're obviously trying to move the character, like, you know, we are trying to move Spock that way, right? And yet at the same time, I do feel like this lesson or what's happening in this issue should teach him that he doesn't need to do that, if that makes sense. Like, I like it because I think it's doing exactly what Kirk wants it to do, but it also seems to be kind of hurting what it is that they're trying to do for the character himself.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I'm a little confused by that direction, unless there's something that comes up later in the issue of why he's so determined to get rid of his emotions. Because even the previous issue, he kind of goes all Kylo Ren in the turbo lift and he's hitting it, you know, like having a spasm in there, just like Kylo Ren did in Star Wars.
Yep.
But yeah, I don't know. And, you know, the other thing I just wanted to bring up real quick, because the one big panel where you see Spock and it's showing all the different, you know, flashes into the future. And I guess they do kind of address, in a sense, the Dominion War, because they do show the Defiant firing at something. But they do point out 1,000-year wick until the galaxy itself burns. I don't know. All we see is explosions in space. I don't know if that's referring to the burn in Discovery in the 32nd century. But if it is, then that's still not enough to rewrite everything, you know. Again, something bigger might be coming up. And again, why is Spock going to try to control his emotions with Kolinahr? What is happening here in these stories, besides what we've seen, is going to make him want to go that route when we see emotions work to his advantage?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that, I mean, it's really interesting what they're trying to do. I just don't necessarily think that it quite. There's some issues I have with where they're trying to go with the whole Spock section.
Same. And that's why I'm wondering if something's going to play out more, because we have Kirk, in a sense, getting to the point that he's going to abandon the Enterprise, and we have Spock working to abandon his emotions. Right. And everyone's going to move on. And I understand what's happening with Kirk and why he's going to do what he's going to do. He's been pushed to that, but what is pushing Spock?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I do, you know, as we've been talking through this and some of the things we've kind of had issues with as we've moved around in this series, I think one of the things is that I'm learning to trust, you know, that they have a place where they're going. You know, some of the things, you know, and in all honesty, I mean, obviously, I think with the last time we talked about the comics, one of the things that didn't really work for us and still doesn't really work for us is kind of how Spock went back in time, you know, and everything and all that. But this does seem like we really do. We've got a plan as to how, you know, we want to bring the character and bring everything together that they've been working on for all of these years. And so I think that we're going to be happy with it. But obviously we'll just have to continue to wait and see. So, well, Bruce, you know, it's always fun when we're going to have a new series that's going to happen. And we do have a new series that's going to come around, and it's the Coda series. And what makes this so fun is we get to do something we haven't done for a while. We've got some covers that are coming out, and we are going to judge some books by their cover, which I'm really excited to do because, gosh, let's start with Moments Asunder. And this is the first cover for this new series that's coming out. And I don't know about you, Bruce, but I'm a fan. Like, I think this cover is legit.
I do too. I mean, come on. It's got the Enterprise E. It's firing some phaser or something going on there, and it's got all my favorite colors going on in the background in space, the blues, the purples, and such. But there's all these lines. And we know that there's something going on with timelines or universes, so that kind of represents that behind it, the clouds and the stars and the lines behind the Enterprise E. But there's a part of the hull that's just a little cut off on the cover, and I got on the shore leave a virtual panel to ask if there was going to be covers put together, and David Mack said that's what they're going to do, and that also leads us to the second cover. But I want to know, besides that, what you thought of the first cover.
Yeah, so I really like this first cover. I think it's really cool. I do think I always loved the Enterprise E. I think one of the things that I really loved is how this kind of reminds me of the time stream from the Temporal Cold War, you know, a little bit. So I thought that was really cool. The artist has really done some homework here. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I don't think we've ever seen a phaser shot come from the Enterprise E at that spot. So that's interesting, coming from the underside of the phaser array on the bottom there of the secondary hull. That's a strange place, I feel like, for that phaser shot to be coming from, but okay. Otherwise, I think this is a really cool cover, and like you said, it does lead into the second cover for The Ashes of Tomorrow, which I think is phenomenal. I mean, it takes everything that I like about that first cover, and I think it one-ups it. Like, it's the... I mean, I hate to say it, but it's the better cover of the two. It's so cool.
Well, yeah, it's got more going on, too. I mean, you've got the new Deep Space Nine station there, which I keep wanting to see more of that.
Yes.
You know? Then we have the Alventine there, which is Ezri Dax's ship, and then we've got those lines and everything, but we also have glass shattering, which makes me also wonder if that doesn't just represent time, but if that also represents the mirror universe.
Good question. Not one that I had actually thought of. But goodness, it absolutely could have something to do with that. That's an interesting thought, Bruce.
I try.
I mean, but it's interesting because I just wouldn't have thought about it bringing in anything to do with the mirror universe.
Because on that shore leave panel, they did mention that they are going to address some of the mirror universe in this from the books, from the mirror universe books.
I think is really interesting. It's a great choice. Obviously, one of the things that, this whole litverse has done is play with the mirror universe. They're using all of the things they had written in every single time period. So I think it's really cool, the opportunity to be able to do that. So yeah, the shattering of the mirror, that's really cool. And I also love, and this is the sad part thing, I think the most, Bruce, is that, as you can see, the new DS9 is slowly fading. And I think, this gives us our real big indication of where we're going. We're going to be bringing this all to a close, right? This is all going to be ending. And, that's sad. It's really hard to leave this universe, the one I think that, both you and I kind of love so much. And so to see that, I was like, oh, it honestly got me in the feels, really, to see that.
Yeah, I've known a lot of people that say, how sad this is, that it's coming to an end. And yes, I've loved this for the last 20 years. It's always still there. As we're rereading a lot of those books. So I'm getting to relive it, but at the same time, I'm excited to see that we're putting a cap end to this as opposed to it just dies off and it just ends. That there's no resolution. There's open storylines that never get resolved. They just fade away, and it's just exciting to me. It's like, ooh, now we get the last chapter of everything we've read. But I also believe that we will return to this someday. I don't know anything. No one has ever hinted anything to me, but in the books, they can do anything. We can revisit this timeline or whatever you call it at this, at any point in time.
I mean, I would say, Bruce, you're 100% correct. Obviously, the best thing about the books is the opportunity to be able to do anything whenever you want. And obviously, this is where things are now because of what's going on with what's on television. And, TV shows and everything don't last forever. And so maybe one day we'll be able to return to this, like you said. But, I agree. I think it's really awesome that Shore Leave panel I thought was really neat to be able to see, like, look, we're wanting to give this closure. We're wanting to allow fans to be able to have a place to be able to celebrate this thing that they've loved for so long. And like you said, one of their big things was not to do what Star Wars did, which was just to end it, and I think that's a better way to go for me personally as well. Like, give us resolution, and I think it respects the fans really well. And I think that's the thing that I'm excited about, is that they respect us enough to be able to say, you know what, you invested so much time into this. And I think the coolest part is that CBS is letting them do it in the first place.
Yeah.
Like, because in all honesty, look, the books don't make them a lot of money, right? Like, they don't.
Yeah. It's a tip.
But, right. But I think the fact that it shows that they do care about the fans that have been in this for so long. And I think that is something to which I will forever be grateful for, CBS and Paramount to do and to allow them to do. So, yeah, I'm super excited about this, man.
Oh, I'm pumped. I'm like, we're nearing we're in the last half of the year. And this is the thing I'm probably the most excited about out of anything.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can't wait.
Would you say this is the final countdown then, I guess?
Yes. It's the final countdown.
Well, Bruce, I think it's time for Chris and I to hit up our interview with Cassandra.
Yes, who's also a big Star Trek fan.
Well, Chris, I'm so excited because I can't remember, honestly, the last time that we had a brand new author to Star Trek books. It's been a while, and we are so excited to have Cassandra Rose Clarke here with us to talk about her brand new Star Trek book, Shadows Have Offended. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. And as Matthew said, I can't remember the last time we had a new author in the team of wonderful Star Trek authors that we love to read. So,
one thing I was really interested in, Cassandra, is, and especially since this is your first time to be on the show, I'm just wondering what your Star Trek story is, because everybody has one. And right. So I'm wondering how you came to the franchise and what made you fall in love with Star Trek.
Yeah, so I actually watched TNG when I was a kid. I have this vague memory of my dad watching it and me. I was very young. I would have been maybe 5 or 6, just sort of sitting in the living room watching it with him. But where I really started to kind of fall in love with it was actually in graduate school, because I went back and rewatched all of TNG. Nice. I actually rented it from the video store and
very nice.
Watched it like literally from episode 1 all the way through, and just fell in love with it, kind of for the first time, even though I had seen it before. And so that was really sort of the start of it for me. And so I watched all of TNG. I started watching all of DS9. I watched the animated series, the original series. Like, I just started watching all of the Star Treks and kind of getting caught up with it. And this, a few years after that, was when the new reboot movie came out. And so I got kind of involved in it from that end as well. But TNG was really kind of my first love. That was the one I watched as a kid, and that was the one that sort of brought me back into Star Trek. And that's the one that has my favorite characters, and just that's kind of my Star Trek. And so it was really exciting when I got invited to write a TNG book out of all of the Star Trek series.
Yeah, that's such a neat thing, because I think I have such a similar story. I grew up in like TNG was the thing that was on television at the time. And then like I really got into watching like Deep Space Nine, and then that became my Star Trek. And then of course Voyager and then Enterprise, and like I did the same thing watching all of the Star Treks, and it is so true. Like so many people, they end up with like having that one Star Trek show that just kind of ends up being their Star Trek, the one that they gravitate most towards, which I think is so neat. It just shows how each of the different series, have a way of kind of like capturing people. And it's kind of neat that there's so many different series to be able to do that. And so,
well, Cassandra, if I can interject real quick, just before we get away from talking about TNG and DS9, the story has very much a TNG episodic feel to it, which we'll talk about later. But your use of the Ferengi is very much influenced by DS9. So maybe you fell in love with TNG, but if you hadn't gone on to DS9, I'm not sure if you would have been able to pull this story together in the way that you did.
No, I think that's definitely true. And I definitely really love DS9, and I specifically really love the Ferengi from DS9. So I was actively pulling. There were some specific episodes of DS9 that I was actually pulling from, because the Ferengi and TNG are they're kind of silly, but I love the way DS9 took those characters and reinterpreted them, or took that species, I should say, and reinterpreted them in a way that just felt really fun. And so I've always loved the DS9 Ferengi for sure.
Yeah. That's so awesome. Like, and just overall, I know you said that TNG is your favorite and it has your favorite characters, but I mean, I would love to kind of like, overall of Star Trek, like who are the characters that ended up standing out to you in it, from any of the series that just like really ended up having an impact on you?
Honestly, probably the biggest one would be Data, which is he is of course from TNG. But his character and his character arc actually inspired my first original novel, which is The Mad Scientist's Daughter. And so like his whole sort of search and desire to be human and have emotions was something that really struck me when I had just finished graduate school, and because I went to graduate school for creative writing. So I was trying to write my like great American novel or whatever. And that idea of an android searching for emotions, for human emotions, really, really struck me. And so that idea sort of became the seed of that book. And that book is sort of a response to Data's story. So he is definitely that character, that Star Trek character that I kind of fell the most in love with, for sure.
Wow. That's so awesome. Obviously Star Trek has been something that's just endured for so long, and it continues today. And I'm just wondering for you, like, what do you think has made Star Trek last this long? What is it, and what has it been for you that's kept it going?
I know for me, the probably the number one thing that I love about Star Trek, and that I know I have a friend who's like a huge TNG fan as well, and so our love of Star Trek sort of fed off of each other, and I know she feels this way too, and that's sort of like the wholesomeness and just sort of general positivity of it, that for me feels really refreshing. Because like sometimes I do want to sit down and watch like Game of Thrones, if anybody remembers that show, or like a horror movie, or something dark and gritty, but sometimes I don't, and sometimes I do want to see like sort of humanity at their best. And I think a lot of people are like that, and I think that's one of the reasons why Star Trek endures. And why each generation sort of rediscovers it, because there is something just very, very comforting about it. While still having sort of the adventure and just like, I don't know, like the action and the weird sci-fi stuff, there's something just it feels familiar. And a lot of times it feels like coming home whenever I'm watching, even like one of the new Star Treks. Like even I was watching, the new animated one, which a lot of people had problems with, but I was like, this feels kind of like TNG. And so even though it's silly and funny, I was like, I feel like this feels so comforting and familiar to me. And I think a lot of people feel that way.
Well, Lower Decks, I mean, if you love TNG, it is a wonderful homage to that series, because the detail that's pulled from that series could only be done by a group of people who truly love and know the original content.
Right.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, to me, Lower Decks has actually been my favorite thing that has been on, the Paramount Plus from Star Trek. And I think you just kind of hit on something, even though there's like a like a over the top zaniness for that show. There is a wholesomeness to it. And I really love that word that you chose, because I think for me, especially all of classic Star Trek that I think of, there is kind of this wholesomeness. There is this like traditional understanding of like what's the best of humanity. And that portrayed is something that is very comforting, you know, in a way that, like, as much as I love it, like a Game of Thrones, you know, that's not that show, you know? And so I think you nailed something that has been percolating maybe in my brain for a while when it comes to like what I still love about Star Trek. And I think you just nailed it. So that's really cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit, like, before we kind of get into the genesis of Shadows Have Offended, how did you get asked to write, you know, a Star Trek book?
Yeah, so it was really kind of felt like this fluke thing. I wrote a couple of books in the Halo universe, and the editor for the Halo books also works on the Star Trek books, and I was at a Halo conference, and he had read my Halo books, and he said, I really enjoyed them. Do you like Star Trek? And I was like, do I like Star Trek? And then he was like, well, we're thinking about doing a TNG book. Do you like TNG? And I was like, yes, that's my favorite one. Are you kidding me? So it sort of felt like everything just sort of fell into place. And so, of course, I jumped at the chance, because I honestly never thought that I would get to write a TNG book, because I had read them sort of back, like I said, when I finished grad school and I was just starting my writing career. I had read the ones from the 90s, and I was like, they're never going to publish like books like this, these like standalone TNG books. And then that's what I got asked to write, which was just really cool.
For me, that was quite refreshing, because I remember in the 90s reading those books, and I have fond memories of a trip that I made to Russia, and I took some books with me, and I didn't have other stuff to do at times, so I was reading those, and I felt like I'm taking in an episode. And, you know, right. And I love the books that we have now, but they have become very serialized and very involved. And I enjoyed going back to having that sort of A-B plot episodic feel in a story. Mm-hmm. And like you, a little bit surprised to see those being published again, but I'm glad they are.
Yeah. I was surprised when they said that's what they wanted to do, but I was like, I'm gonna go for it for sure.
Well, and I think it's interesting because they're bringing kind of like what we fans have termed the litverse to an end with Coda. And so to be able to write with these characters, though, still you want to do that. And the only way to do that is to kind of play in the series again. And so, I mean, it makes sense on that front, which, you know, I'm glad that then it gave a writer like you the opportunity to do something that you were so excited about, which makes me wonder then, you know, where did the genesis for Shadows of Offended come from? Is it something that you had been kind of like thinking about for years that you would like to do? Or, yeah, where did some of this come from?
Yeah, so I got invited to do it, and I was so excited. And then I was also kind of paralyzed with terror, because Star Trek fans are so, you know, demanding, might be the nice way of putting it. And when I was coming up with sort of pitches, I was just like, it was almost like I forgot everything I'd ever known about Star Trek. And so I was kind of really sort of working through a lot of ideas. And I wound up kind of going with, and I talk about this on another podcast, with sort of my standard, like, oh, I need a plot, which is there's a mysterious illness. Let's figure out what's going on. And then I was also outlining this right at the start of COVID, like as it was sort of emerging. And so that certainly kind of was an unintentional influence. And that's, of course, where I got the Crusher plot. And I knew I sort of wanted to write about Crusher and Troi. So that was an obvious fit for Crusher. And then I needed another sort of B plot to figure something, you know, to kind of round it out. And I decided to go with Troi because I knew I wanted to write about both of the female sort of commanders on the ship. And so I was like, well, I love the Betazoids. Let's play around in the Betazoid sort of culture. And that's where the Troi and Worf storyline kind of grew out of.
That's really cool. And I noticed that, and I loved that focus, and mainly because, you know, so many books, they kind of focus, and even just like you look at the TNG movies, like it's Picard and Data show, and really nobody else gets any, play. And so I really loved that this book, you had a specific focus to play with characters, and especially playing with Troi and Worf, a relationship that not a lot of people are always a huge fan of. Mm-hmm. So like giving this opportunity to kind of see that relationship kind of budding and building was really cool. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about like focusing specifically, on each of these characters, especially like with Troi and Crusher and Worf. What was it that you were hoping that to be able to do with these characters that you felt like, I just haven't seen this before?
Well, I definitely wanted to explore the Troi and Worf relationship because I like it. And I know it's unpopular, but I always liked it. I always liked it in the show. I always thought it was kind of sweet and interesting, even though it obviously doesn't work out. And so I wanted, and especially since the publisher said specifically, we're looking for something sort of in the later seasons, season 7. And so I knew I wanted to just sort of play around with that relationship. And so that was something kind of going into it that I definitely wanted to explore. And I also just wanted to see Troi and Crusher doing stuff. I feel like they don't do a whole lot in the show, and they are, I think, they have very important roles on the ship. And I wanted to just sort of explore what those roles look like, and sort of put them in situations where they could shine. And so as I was sort of developing the plot, that was kind of my thought process, was how can I really showcase Troi? How can I really showcase Crusher? How can I sort of explore this Troi-Worf relationship while they're still being professional without it being the focus of the book? Because I knew if I made it the focus of the people would be like, so that's kind of my thought process with that. Was just wanting to sort of see those characters in action.
How did you feel about the Troi-Worf relationship the first time you saw it? You said you rewatched in graduate school, right? So the first time it came along, it was kind of out of the blue at the end of the 7th season, and there wasn't even time to develop it. And it felt very odd to a lot of fans. And after going to graduate school, you said you went for creative writing. Maybe did you see that twist in the writing any differently at that point in your life compared with the first time you saw it?
Yeah, I did. I know a lot of people say it comes out of nowhere. I actually don't think it totally comes out of nowhere, because Worf and Troi sort of have this relationship through Alexander, right? Alexander kind of comes into his life. And so she becomes a sort of surrogate mother to him. So the idea of them eventually having a romantic relationship didn't feel totally out of the blue to me. Although I'll admit, I do think you have to kind of go back and really think about it. And also keep in mind, I watched the whole series in like 2 months or something, right? Like I binge watched it. So I had seen the Alexander kind of storyline like 3 weeks before I saw All Good Things. So it was a lot closer in my mind. So I think that helped me to see it a little bit more. So to me, I can kind of see where it comes from. But I also sort of like the unexpectedness of it. And I feel like in season 7, the show was taking more risks. And I think that was one of the risks they decided to take, which I always appreciate as a writer.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned that, like the idea of like being able to binge a show and you watch it all in succession so you can pick up certain things. And to me, that was my experience, honestly, with, we mentioned earlier, Game of Thrones, and like I didn't have as much of a problem with the end of the show because I had watched it all in such quick succession. Things felt more natural than they would maybe if you'd been waiting years between seasons and you're like, your mind as a fan is racing and, I didn't have time for any of that, so I'm just getting what they gave me without any expectations. Right. And I think that's really interesting when you can go back and do that. And I have to say, was never necessarily a huge fan of that relationship, but I thought the way that you wrote them really was so much fun. And there was, and part of that was the fact that this book had more levity to it. Like we weren't super serious, and that allowed us to be able to play with some of these characters in ways that they don't normally get played with. And so just to kind of see them navigate getting into a relationship and being on the same ship and what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and maybe sometimes not necessarily being appropriate because you're on Betazoid, and Betazoid people don't tend to always be appropriate in the first place. Like all of that I think really worked. So I really appreciated the interactions between them, and that it really made that relationship feel much more whole. And like, so to me, that being your thought process, I think that's one of the things that worked the best for me, is like making that relationship feel more natural.
Well, that's awesome to hear, because that was definitely kind of one of my big goals going into the book, was to sort of show how that relationship might have come to be, as opposed to just popping up randomly in the last episode.
Well, and Chris knows this, but I'm a huge Crusher fan. Always have been. Part of it is I think I always had a little bit of a crush on Gates, and especially as a kid.
Yeah, Matthew is the captain of the Beverly Crushers bowling team.
I mean, I'm just saying, she's amazing. And so I really liked that you gave her more to do in this book. And part of what I loved about it was that I felt like her and Picard were kind of mirrors for each other, because where they are in the series, quote unquote, like they feel tired. Like they've been through so much, and like they're both kind of just looking for relaxation and trying to and she doesn't get it here. And I just love that you kind of were pushing her to the brink, and like she makes this cool breakthrough, and we really give this character the opportunity to do something that she's never done before, which is make first contact, and like I just thought, what a great experience for this character to be able to see, and like that there's so much more to Beverly than just being Wesley's mom or the doctor on the ship. Like she has so much more dimension.
Yeah, that was another definitely one of my goals, because she was I always felt like she was sort of like the mom character on the show. And so I wanted to sort of take her out of that role, and give her a chance to basically kind of do Commandy stuff, right? Like make first contact and figure out, how to sort of save her team and her crew, even when she's not necessarily feeling totally confident about it.
With some of the characters, one of the things that and a focus that I saw was on Picard and his just kind of like being super grumpy in this book. And I'm wondering where that kind of came from in your writing process for Picard.
I think it was because he is in the funnier, lighter storyline, which is the one on Betazoid. And, I've always loved the Picard-Lwaxana interactions. I've always found them. I like Lwaxana a lot. I think she's funny. And I always found her interactions with him quite funny as well. So a lot of it was kind of playing up that sort of grumpiness of him being in a place where he doesn't want to be and having to do things he doesn't necessarily feel like are his strength, which is in this case sort of dealing with a bunch of upset Betazoids. So a lot of it was just trying to sort of pull some humor, and just sort of really play up that sort of stuffy Picard persona with like the wild Betazoids, and they're just spilling everything out and being so dramatic. Yeah. So that's definitely where that was kind of coming from.
Betazoids gone wild.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that video?
Well, it is funny because like I do think that Lwaxana puts Picard on his worst foot in the sense that like he just lets her get to him, and that's something that like I guess later Picard, especially movie Picard, he kind of loosens up a little bit. And yeah, I think that was something that was really interesting to watch him just be so uncomfortable. And part of that, I got the feeling like he just kind of feels a little bit tired too. And it's almost like he needs like everybody on the Enterprise felt like they needed a vacation. And like they were hoping for one. And then this whole, wacky experience happens to all of them and they don't really get what they're looking for. But then they get something that they weren't looking for. And I thought that, you talked about this idea of like, and I hadn't even thought about this until now, the whole idea of like planning all this through like the start of COVID, and that the unexpected can be the best thing for you, even when it doesn't look like it could be the best thing for you, right? And I think that was something that this book had in it as like a nice theme, which was you may find that the most unexpected thing in the world may be the best thing to happen for you, even when you didn't think so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm actually really glad you picked up on that, because I did that sort of intentionally to sort of tie the two storylines together, because I was like, these storylines are very, very different. And I wanted a way to sort of link them. And so that was what I was kind of getting at, was that sometimes you get thrown in these situations where you don't have your strengths. And so you have to kind of make do, and you wind up sort of coming up with something better. And that was kind of the overarching theme that I was going for, to tie the two storylines together anyway.
Yeah. I just think it's really cool. And it's fun when like those things end up working out, in the story. So, and I think you're right. It definitely does help the book feel more cohesive in that way. And so I'm really glad. I loved and I thought it was really fun, the story of stolen treasure that aren't really treasures. Like everybody, the idea that like it's really only treasure because of the value that's put into it, like the Betazoid. So you mentioned wanting to explore the Betazoid culture and all of those things. So I would love to hear about that, because in all honesty, there's not a lot about Betazoid culture that we know.
Right. Yeah. And I realized that when I started writing this book, and I started just sort of making stuff up, and I was kind of like, are they going to let me do this? I wasn't sure.
Someone made it all up at some point, Cassandra, even though a lot of fans don't realize that. Someone made it all up at some point.
That's actually a good point. So I was really kind of pleased where they didn't make me really change any of the Betazoid stuff that I came up with. But yeah, one of the things, so what I've always liked about the Betazoids, because we really just see them through Lexana. We don't even really see them through Troi, because she didn't really grow up on Betazed. Right. And Lexana comes across as sort of this kind of aristocratic woman, and she's, she has all her titles, and she talks about being the keeper of the sacred chalices and all this stuff. And I was really kind of hung up on that, and I was sort of interested in it because they're members of the Federation. And so it was this idea of this sort of socialist utopia, but then you have this culture that it feels to have this sort of aristocracy to them. And so I was kind of interested in exploring how that might work. And so I thought, well, their treasures aren't going to be treasures in the way a Ferengi would see them, but they're going to have cultural value and sort of artistic value, and sort of like the value of story. That was something I was really playing with that whole sequence and the crazy pageant and everything. So I wanted to kind of show how what's important to the Betazoids are sort of their cultural stories, and then these objects just represent that. And that's why they have all these titles, and they have all these ceremonies, and they have all this stuff, because they're playing with, they understand the importance of these cultural stories. And so it's not about sticking to tradition for tradition's sake, and it's not about thinking you're better than one group of people thinking they're better than another. It's just about celebrating these stories. And so that was what that was sort of my inspiration for the Betazoids stuff in the book. And then also I just wanted an excuse to put them in like cool costumes and do kind of crazy ceremonies and things, because it felt like that's what they would do based on how they're presented in the show.
Maybe we'll see some of those costumes at conventions coming up. Get some
litverse
cosplayers.
Yeah.
Where were you, since you're making up a lot of the things then for Betazed, where are you pulling from to kind of get those ideas historically, or what were you kind of using as a reference then for this aristocratic house system?
Yeah, I was definitely pulling sort of from like European history, and especially I was kind of thinking about sort of like the British aristocracy system and how you have these sort of old families, and they have like these houses that are tied to the families, and they may not necessarily have money anymore. They just have the title. And so it was I kind of looked at that because Britain is one of the few places where the aristocracy sort of survived, and now they're sort of this weird institution. They don't really have any power. So I was thinking Betazoid would be something similar to that. They would have all these houses and they would pass the lineage down, but the real power is to be like elected officials because they are still a Federation planet. So I was definitely kind of inspired by that and sort of what a modern sort of socialist utopia aristocracy would look like.
Yeah. And it was interesting too, because like on top of that, you added in this kind of like secret police layer for them, which was very interesting to kind of see them having. And so like, where did that all come from in the story? Because that was a really interesting layer.
That was, first of all, I was shocked they let me get away with that, to be honest. But yeah, that was more, I was really just trying to develop like twists and turns, right? And I wanted to give Aviana, I wanted her to have I wanted there to be some kind of twist there. And some of it was just sort of plot stuff. I'm going back and forth with my editor and making sure things fit in canon. And there was something I had written that honestly, now I don't remember what it was. She's like, this isn't going to work. Oh no, I do remember what it was now. It was that I wanted Aviana to go down on the planet with them. And if she's just a civilian, they're not going to do that. Right. So I had to make her something. I had to give her some reason why she could go down on the planet. And so I had been watching Picard, and then you had the Romulan secret police, the Tal Shiar. And so I was, what if Betazoid had something like that, or Betazed had something like that? And so it just kind of rolled out from there. And then it's also just kind of the idea of psychics being spies, and especially Betazoid culture, kind of, why would they ever need to lie? But what would it be like to be a spy in that culture? So it just sort of spun off kind of like world building questions. That again, I was shocked they let me kind of explore that a little bit.
Well, it is good. It is good world building, because I would expect that most worlds probably would have at some point in their history a police force, security force, spy force, whatever like this. But in Star Trek, we so often get these monolithic cultures until they become the centerpiece, like the Cardassians or the Ferengi on DS9. Once they become the centerpiece of something, we start to learn more about them. But, Betazoid is one of those planets that's mostly just been referenced. We've never had a chance to really explore it. So I love that element as well, because it is starting to bring to life the worlds of the Federation in a way that you would expect they probably are, but you just don't get that chance to get that glimpse very often. Well,
and one of the things that I really thought was really interesting when you talked a little bit about was this idea of then melding it with the Ferengi that we meet here, and the fact that links with a lot of what we kind of saw in Deep Space Nine happening with the secret network of female Ferengi who are using this cloak and dagger type of mysterium to create this mystique, which allows them to be able to do business. And so where did that come from in the story, and kind of working all of that in to the whole like stolen treasure?
Right. Well, I mean, it kind of came directly from Rules of Acquisition, the DS9 episode, where you meet Pel, the female Ferengi, who disguises herself as a man. And I always loved that episode. And I actually really loved sort of the Ferengi arc, like cultural arc in that show, where that you start to see women kind of trying, like fighting for their rights, but then their rights are just to be capitalists, which I thought was funny. It's like, I just like that idea. And I wanted to kind of bring it in. And, in terms of how it sort of came into the book, again, I needed a villain. Somebody needed to have stolen the items, and they needed a reason for it. And so I thought, well, Ferengi, right? And then, Ferengi who maybe have to operate in the shadows. Well, Lady Ferengi, that makes sense. And so that was where how it kind of came together. and just wanting to sort of explore more of these sort of renegade females who are trying to find ways to sort of earn profit and be Ferengi when they can't really yet in Ferengi culture. But we know it's sort of working towards that from DS9.
Yeah, it was cool. It was like an expansion of the DS9 story in that sense.
And it kind of gave us an opportunity to be able to see that, Pell isn't the only one who's in this, and Moogie either, they're not the only two, this is something that, and it really then helped this creating this mystery about this Baron and, this whole idea that it would be somebody who is hidden and that would have a secret and want to keep it and would have to be in the shadows. And so, no, I thought all of that really worked well and was a lot of fun then to be able to get to that reveal. And you're like, oh yeah, duh. Like, of course, like this makes so much sense. So, and then on the whole other side, you have, this planet that Riker, Crusher, and Data are on, and it's all about these aliens in this dreamland. Mm-hmm. And like, I was fascinated with this idea of these kind of like Dreamweavers. Mm-hmm. And then I couldn't stop singing the song in my head. I won't do it here, but
and then you booted up the software and you started creating websites.
Exactly. I kept seeing like signals in the sky. It was really, anyway, where did this idea come from? Because this was a really fascinating idea of an alien species who live through dreams.
Yeah, so that came from me being really fascinated or kind of going through a period of being fascinated by cosmic horror, and just sort of reading a lot of sort of cosmic horror stuff. And I've written a lot of sort of original sci-fi books, and I always love those sort of big idea sci-fi books, especially ones where you have these aliens that are completely inhuman. So I wanted to have that idea of an alien that is so different from us in the way they think and the way they communicate that there's a huge communication barrier. And I think that's, that gets explored in Star Trek all the time. Those are some of my favorite episodes. So a lot of it was wanting to kind of do that. But then I was also like, I was reading all this like sort of Lovecraft and stuff, and it talks about, the Lovecraft monsters sort of dreaming and creating the world through dreams. And I thought that's such a cool sort of poetic idea that I thought, why don't I just make it Star Trek and make it wholesome, right? So that was kind of where all of that sort of came from, was sort of those blend of interests I had at the time that I was working through the book.
Well, it's interesting too, because you said it gets explored in Star Trek all the time, but actually not as much as you would think. The presence of aliens that are truly different than us. We occasionally get those, but more often than not, we get aliens that either we can associate with immediately, or it's just a language barrier that can be overcome by the universal translator, right? But here we have something that truly is beyond our comprehension and creates a mystery. Yeah,
that was definitely just something I just love those kinds of stories. And I see what you're saying, that like most of the aliens in Star Trek, like they just look weird, right? But if they're the center, sometimes if they're the center of the episode, then we get an episode where they're communicate. But yeah, the universal translator breaks, and then we get an episode,
right?
With kind of like coming up with the way in which these aliens kind of communicate, and like, I'm just fascinated with the idea of like creating this culture, and like, it was so alien, and that's one of the things that I liked about it is that it actually felt like we were exploring something completely new. Mm-hmm. And I thought, so for you, how did you keep it straight? Like when because this is really world creation. So like in your process, do you go in and kind of like bullet point how all of this works so you can keep it straight in your own mind? Because this is definitely, we're sky tripping here.
Yeah. No, I definitely had to write it. I kind of wrote it out. A lot of it came in the revision stage, right? So when I was writing or when I was drafting, my goal was make it weird, make it dreamy, make it kind of trippy. sort of poetic. So I was just trying to make it weird. Then in the revision stage, that was when I would go through and sort of figure out, okay, now it has to make some kind of sense. Like it has to, like the reader has to know what's going on. They can't just be confused. So that was where I kind of sat down and said, okay, here's what's actually going on. I mean, I went into it knowing they were sort of like a hive mind, and that there had to be so many people together before they would see them as alive. Like that was sort of,
that was really interesting.
I had that in my head as I was writing it. But in terms of like them living in dreams and sort of what they're saying and all the weird stuff she sees on the beach, that was me just like, I'm gonna just make it weird. And then I had to kind of go back and make sure that it all fit together and it made sense.
You said you started conceiving the story near the beginning of the pandemic, and just what you said right there, I was just imagining if these aliens were looking at Earth in 2020, they might not think that we're alive because there are very few of us together most of the time compared with usual.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, and that's an interesting, like, even that is a really interesting, like, subtle commentary on the fact that we weren't together at that time period. You know, like and I think so many of us ended up learning how much community actually means in our lives, and that we needed to be together. And in some ways, it is a commentary on the idea of like idic too. Like putting all that into the basket makes so much sense then, of how, like, even maybe subconsciously, the fact that we were so alone for so much of 2020 really brought that to the forefront. Because even just the way you like describe about her kind of falling basically down the rabbit hole, and it felt very Alice in Wonderland in that sense, like, and you're very alone, and like they're trying to figure out what one means. Like, what does the idea of one mean? Like, one is the loneliest number, and the idea that they can't conceive of that because they're always together. But for us, we need to be together. We can't just be singular. Mm-hmm. And I thinking more about that, I really like that idea.
Yeah. I definitely think there was some subtle like pandemic influence that was just sort of seeping into my writing, without, explicitly being like, oh, this is going to be about COVID. And I think that was something that definitely kind of came through, because I was living in an apartment. Like I was very isolated while I was writing that. So I think that's where I was like, community, I need community. Yeah.
Well, and I think the reality of then the book, it comes across better because it wasn't just like, okay, I'm going to write about this, like right. I think writers are always much better off when they write a story out of whatever's happening, with not necessarily like, I'm trying to say this. It just ends up coming out of you because that's who you are, what's going on. And that's so much more meaningful because it doesn't come across as preachy, right. And it just comes across as like very sincere. And I think that's really cool about this book, is that those thematic elements are very sincere in the book, and not because you're trying to tell us what to think. We're just feeling along with you.
Right.
And I think that's really awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you're writing as a writer, I do think that you're very much influenced by what's going on around you and what you're sort of watching and reading, and all those things sort of come in and they shine through without you intending on it. You're not saying, oh, I'm writing about COVID. It's just going to kind of come through. And a lot of these things that I saw, especially like the COVID stuff, I didn't really see until after I had written the book. And I'm going, I'm reading you have to read a book like 500 times before it goes to publication, because you're checking for, grammar and all that stuff. And I was doing that
process.
Okay,
very well.
So you know. So when I'm in the middle of that process and I'm reading my book for the millionth time, that's when I start kind of like literary criticism. You start doing like literary criticism on my own writing, and that's when those things started coming through. And I was like, wow, well, yeah, this is where I was at the time that I was writing this, so I guess it makes sense. So I think it's an interesting thought for sure.
Yeah, it's just so I mean, one of the best parts of doing literary treks is the fact of getting inside the brains of the authors and being able to hear, like, what was it? And then even unintentionally, what was it, that was the influence on creating these stories. And it's always so neat. It's one of the things I love about behind the scenes stuff when you're like on a movie or a TV show, and part of that too is like you were specifically tasked with writing a story that felt like an episode. Mm-hmm. And, I feel like for you, that would not have been difficult, loving TNG so much, to create that episodic feel. But getting into the book, did you go back and watch a bunch of 6th and 7th season of TNG, or what helped you kind of get back into that mindset so you could be, know where the characters were story-wise and all that?
Yeah, I definitely went back and watched some of my favorite episodes, sort of later in the season.
So Subroofs, of course,
3 times.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. So I watched some episodes. I watched some DS9 episodes as well. With the Ferengi, I watched some of the Ferengi episodes because I knew it was gonna write about them. And I also just I went into sort of like fan wikis and stuff, and was sort of looking at, like, I looked up what was known about Betazoid, for example, like what had been sort of explored in other sort of other books and things that maybe I hadn't read or hadn't seen. So I did a lot of that as well, just sort of looking up sort of the sort of ones that are focused on the like memory alpha, like looking into all of that kind of stuff, and then stumbling across like fan stuff that people had like made up this whole sort of system for the Betazoids, the house system and stuff. And it's just sort of like kind of immersing myself in the fandom in a lot of ways, was another thing that I did as I was writing the book and researching it.
And you probably read a lot of fan fiction shipping Picard and Lwaxana, right?
I actually didn't read any fan fiction for this, but I have certainly read it in the past. So
I think, though, that's something that is so neat about, Star Trek and just about any fandom, right, is the way in which fans kind of take it, make it their own, and then they just make things up to fill in these gaps, And I think, one of the cool things that you got an opportunity to do, Chris and I have talked about this a lot because we do on the network, the Orb podcast, which is all about DS9. And one of the things that DS9 was so good at was that it was about it would take these races of people that we had known from TNG, and then it would expound upon them and make them less monolithic. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really interesting because you got an opportunity then to do that with a race to which we only know through Lwaxana, and that's it. Mm-hmm. Because Troi, like you said, didn't really grow up on Betazoid, so she's not culturally Betazoid. Mm-hmm. In that way.
The other
and so I thought that was really fun.
We just see glimpses of them. Mm-hmm. We don't really learn about culture very much through them. Mm-hmm.
So as an episode here of like TNG, you got that opportunity to like expound upon what it means to be a Betazoid and make them all different by not having them all feel like they're just one thing. And I thought that was really fun about the book as well.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun to write. I always loved the idea of that was something I loved about DS9, was the way it sort of monolithized these different races, and that was something that I was really excited to get to do with the Betazoids, and just to kind of play around with world. I love world building in general, so it was a chance to really play around with some Star Trek world building.
Which is so important because that's one of the whole points of doing expanded universe literature, is to allow that to happen in a place where it might not be able to happen in a TV show. So I'm really excited that, it seems like the stories now that we'll be getting, we're obviously going to be getting like, Discovery books and Picard books and things like that. But these books allow us to then maybe be able to go back and fill in some of those things and open up, races and species that we've seen in the background, but we've never really explored before. So I think that's a lot of fun. For you, as we kind of look towards the end, what was the experience like for you to get this opportunity, especially in a universe that you loved so much, and to, finally have your first book in it be released?
Yeah, I mean, it was very exciting. And like I mentioned earlier, it was also kind of terrifying. I felt like I had a lot of pressure, sort of that I was almost putting on myself because I love TNG so much. I had written in the Halo universe. I like Halo. I played the games. I was familiar with it, but it wasn't like something I adored. And I also got to make up my own characters. So I wasn't playing around with like established characters. So with the Star Trek book, is like, not only am I writing in this world that I adore, I'm writing these characters that I adore, and I have to find their voices, and I have to kind of get into how they think. And they're not characters I created, right? So that was very challenging for me. And so I had a lot of almost like angst about it. I was like, oh my God, it felt very, very difficult at times. There were times where it felt so challenging. But it was also really rewarding, at the end when I'm reading the final version and I've got all the canon changes and all of that stuff. And then kind of getting to see, sort of my ideas, the fact that they're now sort of part of Star Trek, like some of the stuff I came up with for the Betazoids and all of that. That is just like an incredible feeling. And like I said, when I sort of started my writing career, was when I was falling back in love with TNG. Like that happened at the same time. So it's just very fitting that kind of sort of 10 years on, I got to release a TNG book, and that's just kind of amazing. Like it just feels really surreal. And if you had told me that in 2008, oh yeah, you're going to publish a TNG book, I feel like, you're lying. That's
Right.
not going to happen. That's never going to happen.
It's so awesome. And I think the thing that's so beautiful is how the fans, people that are fans, when they get to work on the material, they don't take it for granted. And I think that definitely shows in the book is how much you love it and how much you care for it. And so, for you, love to give you an opportunity then to tell everybody, where they can find you, where they can follow you and catch up with what you've got going on. And also too, what else that you have out there that they should be picking up.
All right. Yeah. So, the easiest way to find me online is to just search Cassandra Rose Clarke. And my website will pop up, and then I have a link to all my social media. My Twitter handle is absolutely terrible to say out loud, and I didn't realize it when I was coming up with it, but it's at CRCSEEORSEA, and it's a pun on my initials, and that's why it's so confusing. But I am on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. But like I said, if you find my website, you can find me. That's probably the easiest way. I have a lot of books out. I have been telling people that if you enjoyed this one, especially the Crusher plot with the sort of weird inhuman aliens, my most recent book, which is Forget This Ever Happened. It's a YA novel, but don't let that scare you if you're not a YA reader, because it's very much in that vein of dealing with sort of weird inhuman aliens. And it was really kind of inspired by Philip K. Dick. So sort of like weird Philip K. Dickian sci-fi. That's also YA. And that book just recently came out. So it's available in bookstores. And then I also have a adult fantasy novel coming out at the top of 2022 called The Beholden, which is just sort of a standard adventure fantasy. But if you go to my website, you can see all my other books that I've written. I've written quite a few, some fantasy, some sci-fi. I have a book of poetry. So you can just kind of take a look, and if anything strikes your fancy, you can pick it up.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Do you know if you'll have any other Star Trek books that'll be coming out?
I have no idea. But if I get asked, I will certainly not turn it down.
And I've got one more question. I'm thinking about this. So you got to write a TNG book. So if you could pick any other series and any other characters to focus on, what would it be?
So this is going to sound really weird, but so And in another series, I would actually love to write a Lower Decks book. I think that would be super fun. It would just be so referential, I guess. I think that would be a lot of fun. But my sort of dream book, and I've mentioned this on other podcasts, would be to write a book about Lwaxana Troi, maybe DS9 era, but just seeing her being an ambassador, like seeing her out doing ambassador stuff. And that's something that I think would be really fun to write and explore.
And what's kind of cool is, I mean, I'm thinking you could also use that as an opportunity to basically do her whole life story as well. Like really give us, that is awesome. So, well, I'm so excited that we got a chance to talk to you, and it is so great to meet you and have you on Literary Treks. Hopefully, you'll get to write another Star Trek book so we can have you back. But I just think the neatest thing is, we were talking about at the beginning, it's so great to have a new voice in Star Trek literature, and, the excitement and just the sheer joy that I can even see on your face. Like when you're getting to talk about what you got to do is so awesome. And I love when we get to see like people's dreams come true like that, and be a part of the fandom that they love. And so I'm just super excited for you.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. It's been really fun, like kind of doing all these Star Trek podcasts and just getting to talk about Star Trek.
Bruce, it is always so much fun to be able to have authors on the show, and I'm so grateful that we have a brand new author here in Cassandra for the Star Trek series, and as we talked about in the news segment, Star Trek is going to be going in a different direction with the books, in the way that it's going to be handling things, and so getting some fresh blood in there, not a terrible idea.
I know. I mean, I love the authors that have always been writing the Star Trek books in the last decade and more. I can always rely on them. I know what I'm going to get, but it is very interesting to bring someone new in and see what they bring to the table. And, she knows her stuff. She knows her Star Trek. So, kudos to her.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what I've always noticed for the most part is that the best writers in any franchise are people who actually love the franchise. And she definitely loves the franchise, so that's super exciting. Well, Bruce, before we get out of here, let everybody know, of course, where they could find you.
I'm on Twitter at Admiral_Rex. That's Admiral, then the underline Rex. And I'm also on the Star Wars Report, which, we're wrapping that show up when we reach episode 501, which is amazing because that show's been on for more than a decade. But who knows when it ends, which will probably be in the spring of 22. It may continue on as something else or occasional episodes. So I wouldn't say it's quite dead, but it's nearly dead. But we'll see.
It's of
course I know, it's so sad. And then Positively Trek is the other podcast I do with Dan Gunther, where we talk everything about Star Trek, even to the books and the comics and the episodes and the merchandise and just whatever. That's it.
Awesome. Well, of course, you can find me all over the place. Matt Rushing02 on all the social media platforms. Of course, you can also find me here on the network doing the 602 Club, which is our general geek show talking about all of the fandoms we love. Of course, Snyder Cuts in that feed with John Mills talking about all the things that Zack Snyder's directed. You can also, of course, find me here as well with Chris Jones talking about Star Trek Deep Space Nine on the Orb, and which is always a ton of fun. I love getting to talk about that. And over on the Nerd Party Network, doing a couple of shows. One is Owl Post with Drea Kaufman, where we talked about each and every chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And last but not least, the one and only John Mills doing aggressive negotiations with him, a Star Wars podcast. And, we just get together every week and talk something fun in the Star Wars universe. So thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.